Well, hello everyone, and thank you for being here. I am so excited to learn about Batman with you all tonight. My name is Emily Whitney, for those of you whom I haven't met, and I work in the advancement office here at Wabash. And tonight I am excited to welcome Dr. Julian Whitney. Julian has been with us since 2020, which we were just talking about before we began tonight, that must have been an interesting year to start a new professorship at a new school. Dr. Whitney was educated at Emory University, where he did his doctorate in English, and he now is a professor in the English department here. I think that's all of the housekeeping I have, Dr. Whitney, so the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for having me. This was the Batman was the topic of my freshman tutorial last semester. And I'm thinking about one of my advisees from last semester, who, when I sort of met with him, he was like, "Oh yeah, I told my parents that my tutorial, or like there was a tutorial topic that's listed as Batman," and they looked at me and they said, "Why are you lying to us?" And so, it was sort of like, this kind of thing. No, it's actually a real thing. Like, this kind of thing exists. So we had a lot of fun sort of trying to get a sense of what the sort of mythology of Batman can essentially tell us about, the world in which we live in, and sort of why it seems to be such a relevant and enduring topic that people are constantly coming back to. I mean, if you were to sort of compare the Batman mythology to Marvel, it's sort of like, with Marvel, you have these different characters that sort of have their own films and they sort of have their own spotlights. But with Batman, it's kind of interesting how you've got this central character, right, that is constantly being reinvented depending on what time it is, and sort of what the audience wants. And so it's interesting how that tells us something about what it is that people find so compelling about the character. So the way that I sort of wanted to start with this is there are two quotations that I sort of think of that do a really good job of trying to chart this sort of Batman trajectory in terms of thinking about his own development. And the first one is from Christopher Nolan's first film, Batman Begins, from 2005. And this is a quotation towards the end of the film where he has to save Gotham City from Scarecrow. And so his childhood friend Rachel does not yet know that Bruce Wayne is in fact Batman. And so, he sort of, before he sort of goes off to save the city, he says, "It's not who I am underneath, but what I do that defines me." And I think that that's interesting because for Bruce, it's sort of like what he's saying is that whoever exists underneath this mask doesn't really matter at all, right? It's the fact that the person, this Batman persona, can do things, right, that normal people cannot do. And so it sort of establishes the character as sort of very mystical in the fact that his actions are what he wants to be defined by, right? It doesn't matter who the person is underneath. And so as a consequence, he sort of becomes a symbol, right? There's a moment like earlier in that film before he becomes Batman, where he's saying to Alfred when he comes back to Gotham City after he's been away for so long, Bruce Wayne can only do so much, but Batman can do so much more. And so it's kind of ironic because Bruce Wayne is the richest person in Gotham City, but he seems to think that he's limited in terms of how he can help the city. So he turns to this Batman persona as a way to do things that Bruce cannot. So that sort of forges the beginning of how he's thinking about this idea of Batman. And then when we get to the Dark Knight, where things just, become horrible, you have this quotation from Harvey Dent that they're sort of both, so Bruce and Harvey are at this fundraiser. And, Harvey Dent he's the new district attorney. He's been locking up a lot of criminals. He's been establishing a reputation for himself in addition to Batman. And he says to Bruce, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain, which is sort of foreshadowing how that film ends, where Batman realizes that not every decision that he makes is going to be one that people are going to see in a good light, right? That in a way, part of being Batman means being able to make the tough decision, which oftentimes means that your own reputation is going to suffer as a result. And I think it's key when he says to see yourself become the villain, right? That sort of Batman is sort of seeing how he is having this negative impact on the city, which then causes him to question everything that he does as a result. And so this image is so interesting because, you know, he's like, this is from The Dark Knight Rises, but it's interesting to sort of think about the Batman persona as different from Bruce Wayne, but that they can't exist without one another. Okay. So there are three questions that I'd like to sort of have us think about over the course of the presentation. The first is, who is Bruce Wayne and Batman? Like, what is his personality? What is his identity? Right? Sort of, how does he become the person that he is? And then the second thing is sort of, what purpose does he serve? Right? So what is his significance? Why is he important? What does he do? Right? What can he teach us through his actions? And then the last thing is sort of, why does Batman remain a compelling figure in popular culture? Right? We constantly refer back to him. The films are going to continue to be made about him. The comic books are going to continue to be written about him. The video games are going to continue to be created about him. And so why is it that he remains such a central part of this sort of American collective popular culture? You know, so those are the sort of the three areas that we'll be thinking about. And this image is sort of interesting. I like this a lot because this is from The Dark Knight, and this is right after Bruce's friend Rachel gets killed in a bomb explosion. So it's like he has to choose between whether he's going to save Harvey Dent or whether he's going to save Rachel. And he chooses to save Rachel, but the Joker tricks him by giving him the wrong location of where to go. So this is after both of the buildings explode, and you sort of have this really interesting shot where you sort of see, like, this is the first realization that sort of Batman has, that the impact that he's having on the city is not the one that he necessarily intended, and that there are going to come consequences with the actions that he takes. So this is a sort of I think an interesting place to start, because this is the central event, right? I mean, one of the things that even people who don't sort of read Batman comics and don't consider themselves to be, you know, deeply informed in the Batman lore, they all know the thing about the fact that his parents were killed before his very eyes, right after they left a play together in Gotham City. And so they're killed in the alley that's known as Crime Alley. And that becomes a symbolic place, because that is the place in which we think that's where Batman was born. Like, even though he doesn't, put on the mask, that this is where he sort of realizes that he needs to be something else to sort of be stronger, essentially. So here's a representation, a sort of a comic book representation of this. And so it reads, 19 years ago, the bastard shot her in the head and chest. I heard her cough her last, and I pressed my hand against my mother's breast, just in case there was any hope at all. And there wasn't any heartbeat, no hope at all. Just her blood on my hand. It'll never wash off. Never. So there are two things going on here. The first is he's talking about the fact that he's witnessing the death of his parents before him, and he's having to come to terms with the helplessness that he feels in being unable to prevent it, but also feeling responsible for it, right? And so this is a deeply traumatic thing for a young child to have to go through, to feel like they were the ones personally responsible for their parents' death. And so he realizes this because he's pressing against her mother's chest and sort of coming to the realization that she no longer has a heartbeat. But this line here where he says, just her blood on my hand, is so significant, right? Because in a literal sense, he's got blood on his hands. But then, of course, there's this sort of other meaning of that phrase, which is he has blood on his hands, right? So he feels as if he is the one responsible for this, that in some way he helped create this outcome. And so that then becomes the trauma that he deals with for the rest of his life that he really never gets over. And so it's interesting because even when Bruce grows up, you could make the argument that he always has that child within him that always believes that he was the one who was at fault, right? He says it'll never wash off, never. And so that begs the question, well, if the blood will never wash off, then is he essentially saying that he's going to be Batman forever? That this is sort of his life's calling that he's going to devote himself to? So it's really sort of interesting to think about how a child is sort of trying to process all of these different emotions and what does this mean for his own development. So when I taught the Batman course last semester, there was an article that I had the students read, and we sort of talked about it. And this is an article that you can find in the Atlantic magazine, and it's titled Batman's Traumatic Origins by Richard Warshak. And one of the things that's really, really interesting about it is that I didn't realize that you could actually trace the sort of mythological origins of Batman to a certain kind of origin story of Bob Kane, who was responsible for creating the character. And so in the article, Warshak talks about how Bob Kane had this experience sort of growing up in the Bronx, where I happen to be from. So it's kind of interesting to sort of see that geographic connection. And so I think he's sort of learning violin, and he's going home with this violin, and he gets jumped by this gang called the Vultures. And so they break, I think they sort of injure him in some way, and they probably break part of the violin. And so there's this sort of question about, like, was that experience sort of foundational for Bob Kane's understanding of Batman as somebody who has something really bad happen to him and then feels personally responsible? It's like, you're walking, down the street in the Bronx and you've got this violin. Of course, it's like you're inviting someone to come mess with you. And so there's this interesting conversation that Warshak has where he says, maybe this sort of explains the reason why Bruce Wayne has the kind of origin story that he does, where he feels responsible, right? That it actually comes from a personal experience that the creator behind Batman had himself. So it's really, really interesting to think about that. So why is the death of Bruce Wayne's parents, so significant and informative for Bruce? Well, the first, as I sort of mentioned before, is that there's a certain kind of trauma and helplessness that's associated with witnessing his parents murdered before him, right? He can't do anything, right? He sort of realizes the limits of his own power. And as a consequence, the trauma that he carries with him is the belief that if he had only been stronger, he could have done something different. He could have somehow altered the outcome. And, for us reading, it's kind of like, well, this is a lot of pressure for him to put on himself, right? But in Bruce's case, particularly his father, Thomas Wayne, is such an idol in his mind, to sort of see him struck down like that just completely destabilizes his worldview, right? So then that leads to the second part, which is feeling responsible for his parents' death and a sense of personal guilt that he cannot defeat. So he carries this with him for his entire childhood, and it's that guilt that then defines him, right? It's that guilt that becomes the thing that sort of prompts him to say, what is it that I could have done differently? And I think that this is the moment where you begin to see the Batman persona creep in, because Batman as a character is riddled with guilt, not just in terms of the parents dying, but we'll sort of get onto it later on when he loses comrades, when he feels personally responsible for the death of someone else, he's always wrestling with this sense of guilt. And so how do you do that? Well, you try to do the best that you can to avert these catastrophes from happening again, right? By trying to protect the people of Gotham. But this last point is really, really interesting. And this gets to the sort of the focus of his father, Thomas Wayne. So I say here, it's a reflection of Gotham's inability to shield and protect either the wealthy or the vulnerable. Thomas Wayne is he's the wealthiest person in Gotham. And he's also a major philanthropist. So he was a sort of a pivotal force in trying to create productive change in Gotham City. So what does it mean when the shining hero of Gotham is the one who gets murdered by the sort of the thievery and the sort of the criminal underbelly of Gotham City? What does that mean? Well, it means that not even the wealthy, right, can be protected from the crime of Gotham. And so what you see here is a sense that Gotham City is incapable of protecting either the wealthy or the vulnerable, right? I mean, the cops did not get to Crime Alley quick enough to save Bruce's parents from dying. So if the police can't do it, and if the law can't find the people responsible and bring them to justice, then this is where Bruce Wayne thinks, well, then I have to step in, right? I have to be a different kind of force that allows that to happen. So when we think about this as a foundational story, it allows us to understand how he then transforms himself from Bruce to Batman, right? And this question, this sort of concept of fear is a pivotal part of that, right? The fear that he feels is the fear of losing someone. He doesn't want to lose someone because he's experienced that, and it's completely shaped his entire worldview. So what does he do? He turns fear from a weakness into a weapon. Now, that gets symbolized through the bat, right? This idea that he's afraid of bats because he fell into a cave that was full of bats, and that was a very sort of difficult experience for him. But this idea that fear becomes his weapon, right, is such a sort of a pivotal part of his character, right? He doesn't have superpowers, but he knows how to manipulate people's fears, because if there's anyone who's experienced fear the most, it's Bruce Wayne himself. Now, this other part, sort of obsessed with correcting the imperfections and corruption of Gotham City, is sort of interesting because it's like he sort of, his reason for becoming Batman is rooted in the idea that Gotham City is somehow failing to protect its own citizens, that he needs to step in and be that additional force. And so he sees that there's something imperfect with Gotham that he needs to be able to rectify. And so that's where he sort of inserts himself. And this last part where he says a conviction that Gotham needs something more than Wayne, right? The Wayne name to protect it. And so that's where the Batman idea comes into play. So now we sort of get into this conversation of, after he sort of grows up and then he assumes the mantle of Batman, how does this change him? And this is where the duality between Bruce and Batman becomes incredibly important. And you see this explored over and over again in the films, these two polar opposites that are somehow existing as one. So when I talk to my students about Bruce and Batman, I try to frame it as it's a dual personality. There's sort of two parts of one fractured whole, right? That there's something fractured in Bruce Wayne that sort of requires him to be Batman, that there are things that he can only do by being Batman that he can't do by being Bruce Wayne. So when we think about Bruce Wayne, it's like, what do we know about him? Well, we know that he's a billionaire playboy who masks his image to hide his feelings. He's got so much money. He gives back to the community. He's always going on these dates. He's always bringing, someone new to these parties. And no one really knows sort of what he does with his money outside of when he gives to charities and things like that. And so he has this sort of mask that he puts on in part because he doesn't want people to connect the fact that he's Batman. But I think the other reason why he puts the mask on is because he's very afraid to allow people to see who he truly is, right? Which is the fact that he's actually a deeply damaged individual, right? Despite all the wealth that he has. And so the Bruce Wayne becomes a sort of a mask. At the end of Batman Begins, Rachel says to Bruce, the mask that you put on, the Batman persona, this is now your real person, right? The Bruce Wayne part of you is actually the mask, right? So it's like when he becomes Batman, he's sacrificing a part of his Bruce Wayne personality to become that, right? And that comes with a lot of consequences as well. So the next thing that's interesting about Bruce Wayne, and this becomes important when you sort of think about his relationships to Robin and, you know, Nightwing and all these other sidekicks that he has, is he has trouble trusting others. He's very, very skeptical of putting anyone in a position that he feels like he can do a better job of. And in addition to trusting others, he also struggles to develop meaningful romantic relationships with women. This is something that comes up over and over again, his sort of inability to sort of open himself up enough to be vulnerable, right? We see this with Catwoman as a really good example, where in many ways they're mirror images of each other, but for any number of reasons, he can never seem to develop that long-term relationship and kind of just let the Batman thing go and just be happy. And then the last part is that, you know, he feels this pressure, right? He's the Wayne. And so with that comes a legacy that he needs to uphold. And, you know, a lot of people criticize him for not being able to rise to the standard of his father. But then, of course, it raises the question, when he becomes Batman, is that the way to carry on the Wayne legacy, or is there another way to do this? So when he becomes Batman, we see a completely different side of him. He's willing to bend and break the law to pursue his own personal definition of justice. Now, this is where things get complicated, right? Because now he has issues with the police, and, you know, we can't really tell what his motivations are. Is he good? Is he bad? And this makes him a complicated figure, because now it brings up the question, is this just a pseudo-fascist who's sort of going on these night raids, doing what he wants, and no one can tell him otherwise, right? The next part is that he has this sort of moral code of no killing, right? That's the thing that separates him from his adversaries, that he is unwilling to take a life, because if he takes life, then he becomes nothing more than the criminal itself. But there's the problem, right? It's in his attempt to protect Gotham that he introduces a new state of chaos that causes Gotham to kind of come apart at the seams, right? Batman's presence invites more conflict. And that's the reason why you have someone like the Joker who comes out, because they see that Batman is a destabilizing force, and he almost invites these other people to join him, right? So that's one of the sort of complicated and problematic aspects of him. So I'm just, for the purposes of this presentation, going to look at two sort of critical sort of representations of Batman, the graphic novels and the films. And so a significant sort of place to start is A Death in the Family, which is a really, really important graphic novel for Batman, because this is the first Robin, Jason Todd, who ends up dying, and Batman feels responsible for it. So this is an interesting story because it doesn't actually take place in Gotham. This is actually a globe-trotting adventure where they go to Lebanon and Ethiopia because they're trying to find Jason's estranged mother. And the Joker is in this, and he's like got this alternate political motive because he's trying to sell missiles to terrorists. So then you have this sort of underlying political commentary that's going on here. And so you have a Batman graphic novel that's both about family, which is very personal, and geopolitical strife, right? It's taking place during the 80s. So there are obviously conversations about the Cold War that are going on here. And so there are a series of events that lead to Jason Todd's death, in part because he's impulsive and he's brash, but also because Batman is really incapable of seeing what Jason is after, right? And it's kind of surprising because he also lost his parents, but it's like Jason wants to be reunited with his mother. But in the process, this is the first great tragedy that strikes him, and that really shapes him. And so if you look at a sort of an example, so here's an example from A Death in the Family where we have a comic book slide. We have this sort of relationship between the two. And so I'm just going to read there. This is at the very beginning of the comic. They're trying to, bust a crime unit that's going on. And Jason just goes right in, just guns blazing, doesn't listen to Batman. So Batman says, "Don't you understand? There are procedures even we have to follow. I promised to let Gordon in on the bust. You jumped the gun. What's worse, you nearly got yourself killed doing it." And then Jason says, "Near misses don't count. What do you think you're doing here, playing some game?" And he says, "Of course, all life's a game." So it's interesting how Jason doesn't really sort of see the value of life. He doesn't really take it seriously. And he kind of sees the Robin persona as just a way to get even, right? Which I think is sort of really, really interesting. Because it's like Batman's trying to teach him how to be different than that. But, he's just brash and impulsive and he really can't be controlled. But it's interesting because they're very similar, right? They come from similar backgrounds. They're both orphans. And so Bruce sort of sees a part of himself in Jason, which then says, "Let me train you to be the next Robin." But there's this lack of trust between the two of them. And this is where I was referring to before, the inability to forge meaningful relationships, right? That there's this lack of trust between the two of them. And that's really where their relationship breaks apart. And so it's interesting to think about the fact that Batman is training Jason to be Robin, but also to be the next Batman. But this is a person who, if he actually became Batman, would be a very, very destructive force. So it calls into question, maybe what Batman is doing is not necessarily in the best interest of Gotham City if you're actually training someone who could become a killer himself, right? And so Jason's real failure is the inability to monitor his own emotions. But I think Bruce blames himself for that, because he blames himself for not giving Jason the time to work through his own family loss in order to come out on the other end. And so again, right, he sort of feels the sense of guilt for Jason's death. So this is sort of a key part of Batman's persona in terms of what he feels like he's losing and the sense of guilt that he feels. So we have this in terms of A Death in the Family, right? This is one expression of Batman. And we have another example here, which is a famous comic book. This is the one that all the students really, really love, The Long Halloween, where the basic premise is that there's a person called the Holiday Killer who kills people on holidays, and it's a mystery. And so they're trying to figure out, well, who's responsible for this? And this is the graphic novel that Christopher Nolan turned to for inspiration for creating Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, because you have this interesting relationship between Bruce, or between Batman, Harvey Dent, and Commissioner Gordon. So they're sort of working together. And you see that relationship in the Dark Knight films. So we've got this guy called the Holiday Killer. We don't know who he is. We actually come to find out that it's multiple people that are killing on holidays. And this is significant because this is the moment when Harvey Dent, the district attorney, turns into Two-Face, which becomes the inspiration for The Dark Knight. And so one of the things to think about here is this question of what is it that we're supposed to believe in? There's a quote that comes up over and over again in this graphic novel. I believe in Harvey Dent. This idea that he's the district attorney. He represents justice. He represents morality. But what happens when Harvey Dent becomes Two-Face? What happens to that sense of justice and morality? Who can we believe in to save Gotham if we can't turn to the person who's supposed to have justice at heart? And so there is a really interesting sort of comic slide here where there's sort of this conversation going on between Batman, Commissioner Gordon, and Harvey Dent. And Harvey is kind of questioning whether the law can actually do what it says it's supposed to do, right? So they're trying to lock up this criminal organization, the Falcone organization. And Harvey Dent says, he's just a man like any other, except he puts himself above the law. Commissioner Gordon says, that doesn't mean he is. Oh, really? Then go and arrest him, Captain, right? And then he says after that, I've got files full of unsolved robberies, hijackings, murders with his name all over them. His money will buy the witnesses, the cops, the judges. So you see that Harvey Dent is questioning whether the legal system as it currently exists can actually bring people to justice. They have to rely on Batman because the police can't do it alone, because the justice system can't do it alone. So it kind of creates this unholy alliance between these different individuals, and it kind of calls you to question, like, well, I mean, if the laws can't work, then what is it that we can sort of rely on? And it's this skepticism of the law that causes Harvey Dent to really become two-faced, that he's tempted to go the extra mile, to actually kill in order to get what it is that he needs, because he feels like the law can't do it alone. And this is where you see, right, Christopher Nolan coming out in terms of his portrayal of Harvey Dent. So I would definitely recommend reading The Long Halloween, because it's such a foundational text for how the films approach a lot of these characters. So in that vein, just let's talk briefly about the films themselves. I like to think about the films primarily in terms of like two major sort of eras, because there are so many films. But the Tim Burton era, yeah, I think is the sort of the foundational era. I think that Tim Burton did so much in the original Batman and Batman Returns to establish the aesthetic of how Batman is supposed to look and operate and everything like that. And these films are really interesting because they've got this really cool Gothic aesthetic. When you sort of watch Tim Burton films and you sort of see how he creates his characters. And it's like every character in this film is so deeply damaged. Batman is, Catwoman is, she's actually the sort of the victim of workplace abuse. And I mean, then you've got the Penguin who's been abandoned. And there's this like this political subplot that he tries to become mayor of Gotham City. And so Tim Burton's sort of iteration of Batman is thinking about the psychological duality, not just of Batman, but of all these deeply flawed characters. At the same time, he uses his films to talk about politics and to talk about how these characters interact with the political realm of Gotham City and trying to infiltrate this sort of corrupt parts of the political establishment. But the part of these films that's really interesting, particularly in Batman Returns, is the fact that you have this romance going on between Batman and Catwoman, and they're both sort of dealing with the same issues. They both have their own sense of trauma. They both feel a sense of isolation because they both feel alone, right? This film takes place during Christmas time. So it's the one holiday where everybody's supposed to be together, and they're the ones who are staying it apart, right? So it tells you something about that sense of loneliness that they feel. And really the failure of people to find a sense of love. All three of these characters, Batman, Catwoman, and Penguin, you could argue that they all suffer from the same issue, that they haven't had the ability to find love for someone else, and that's what causes them to do these type of things. So it's interesting because these are very human emotions that we all feel. And what does it mean when we see these characters reflected back to us, right? It tells us something about the very foundational things that we need as human beings to live productive lives. And these characters, they don't have those. And I think that these were just really good inspirations for the kind of Batman that we see in the Christopher Nolan films. So going on to that, now we have this sort of, I mean, this is this sort of the iconic trilogy that I think to this day has still defined the way that we look at Batman. It's like there's the Christopher Nolan era, and then there's the post-Christopher Nolan era. And it's like everything refers back to that. So this is a grounded approach to Batman. This is a Batman that takes place in a world that we can see, right? everything's shot in Chicago. So it's like, it's a world that we can identify with. It's a city that we know, right? That we can associate with, and they're dealing with issues that honestly we probably deal with in everyday life as well, right? So he's got his trilogy here. And the way that I like to think about the Christopher Nolan trilogy is that it's actually, I think, less about Batman and more about Gotham City as a whole, right? It's a story about Gotham City, about what Gotham City has to endure before the citizens lose complete faith in the ability for anyone to stand up for them. And so Batman becomes a part of this. But it's really interesting to think about how Gotham goes through these sort of trials of, we got this Batman guy, he's doing some good stuff for the city, we feel like we're finally turning a corner, and then just it invites more chaos and more chaos. And so the next thing is, it's a narrative about what Batman will cost Gotham City, right? Well, what he costs Gotham City is that he's just inviting more people to cause chaos. And so one of the things that emerges from this, and this is really important in The Dark Knight Rises, Bruce Wayne cannot find a life outside of Batman. And this is something that Alfred really does not like. He wants him to find a life outside of Batman because Batman has been responsible for so much trauma and guilt, right? So Batman becomes an all-consuming part of his identity, and Bruce is trying to figure out a way beyond it. And then the last part I think that's really interesting about the Nolan trilogy is the dividing line between the hero and the villain, right? The fact that Batman invites chaos. And there's no sort of perfect example than the Joker himself, right? We always think about The Dark Knight because of Heath Ledger's performance. And I have students who say, Dr. Whitney, they could have just named the film The Joker, and that could have been it, because it's a lot more about him than it is about Batman. So there are some very interesting quotes that I sort of want to point our attention to here. This is a famous interrogation scene from The Dark Knight. So this is right before the Joker tells Batman that he's got two hostages and Batman has to choose which hostage he's going to save. And so he's tempting him. And what he's essentially saying to him is, regardless of all your strength, you can't figure out a way out of this, right? So there's a way in which the Joker outsmarts him. So we have this interaction between them, and there's a very interesting line that the Joker says. He says, "I don't want to kill you. What would I do without you? You complete me." So this is interesting. So I guess the Joker is just saying that he just wants to torture Batman, right? But this idea of what would I do without you? Batman's presence is what gives the Joker's life purpose and meaning. That is a very, very problematic thing to say, because what it means is that Batman is actually having a negative impact on the city because he's inviting these crazy people to test him. And then we have this other line, "You complete me," which I think is really, really phenomenal, because it's like what he's saying is, you and I are the same, right? I mean, you have your own twisted, traumatic pain, and you're sort of working through it in your own ways, but, we're pretty much the same people, right? And so to sort of have Batman hear that, it's like, well, what does that actually mean for him? And so there's another set of quotations that I sort of wanted to point our attention to. I was thinking about this because there's a video clip that I was watching in preparation for this at the very, very end of the film. And it's where you have Harvey Dent, who is now Two-Face. He's holding Commissioner Gordon's children hostage. And what he's saying is, I lost the person who's the closest to me, so now you're going to lose the person who's closest to you. So Batman arrives, and they have this very interesting conversation where they talk about essentially how things came to be the way that they are. And so Two-Face is essentially saying to Gordon and Batman, this has to happen because of what I had to suffer. Someone has to pay, because he's thinking about an eye for an eye, right? If I had to suffer, then someone else has to suffer. So they're talking about this, and the Joker's the one who's responsible for, convincing Harvey Dent to become Two-Face. And so Two-Face says to Gordon and Batman, the Joker chose me. And Batman says, because you were the best of us. He wanted to prove that even someone as good as you could fall. And Two-Face takes a pause and he says, and he was right. So this is really, really interesting. The Joker chooses Two-Face, right? He chooses Harvey Dent because Harvey Dent represents the best of Gotham City, the only hope of Gotham City having a hero. And he's able to turn him in to a villain. So if you can take the best that Gotham City has to offer and turn that person into a villain, then I guess what that means is that we really have nothing to believe in. You can't believe in Batman because he's bringing chaos to the city, and then you can't believe in Harvey Dent because he's shown that he too can fall. And when Two-Face says, and he was right, I mean, that's gut-wrenching because he's acknowledging the fact that he wasn't good enough to resist the Joker's temptations. So these are sort of really interesting ways in which the films are trying to get at these complicated dualities that exist within human beings and the struggle between good and evil. And so in thinking about the films and the graphic novels, to go to the final part in terms of thinking about why is Batman a compelling figure in popular culture? Well, I think the most sort of apparent part is because he actually represents our world pretty accurately, both in terms of the graphic novels and in terms of the films. It's a fictional representation of our real world. And that the comics and the the films and the media, it offers us a way to think about vigilantism, heroism, and justice. What happens when you have good intentions, but they actually produce bad outcomes? What do you do with that? And I think that Batman is sort of really useful for exploring those issues. So to recap on some of these things, we have here that Batman can be used to explore some pretty foundational questions about trauma and guilt and how characters deal with them as one thing, not just Batman, but other characters as well. And then we also have the law question. This is really interesting to me because one of my other areas of interest is the intersection between law and literature. But, it's interesting to think about how Batman sort of media is an indictment on law and systems of justice and things like that. There's also an examination of family dynamics and a desire for love and acceptance. It's a deeply personal story about how we form relationships with different people. It's a communal myth. This is a term that comes out of that Rorschach article I was mentioning before, where everyone is contributing to the Batman myth in some way or another. And so he's constantly being expanded upon and revised. And so we're all contributing to it. One of the assignments I had my students do last semester was to write their own Batman story. So they were able to think about, well, how do you actually write a Batman story? What is sort of part of that? Then there's the question of identity, right? How does one man or one woman or one individual sort of wrestle with these polar opposites of their identity? And this last part about sort of how we can think about how Batman is used to sort of discuss the types of social issues that matter in our moment in time. I just want to sort of bring up the most recent Batman film to close with. This is Matt Reeves's The Batman, which was released last year. I love this film because it finally features the Riddler. And in that film, the Riddler only becomes the Riddler because of social media. that film is in many ways a commentary on the way in which social media can be used to prop up different personalities that would otherwise be marginalized in society. And so it's interesting to think about the fact that social media can be a villain unto itself. And so it's really cool to think about Batman as a reflection of these ongoing conversations that we're having in the world today. And so I think that's one of the reasons why he continues to remain such an enduring character in our popular culture. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Whitney. That was wonderful. If you are able to, Professor, stop sharing your screen, we can open it up to question and answer. We've got about 10, 15 minutes. Cool, make sure speaker view is on. Okay, I'm gonna go through the chat. Let's start there. Folks were really engaged and posting questions during your presentation. The first question is from Bruce Buckmaster. Is there any significance to the Mark of Zorro being the movie that young Bruce Wayne saw with his parents? And then other attendees added that sometimes it's an opera, sometimes in different movies or comics, it's a different performance or movie that the Wayne family attends. Could you talk a little bit about that significance?
Yeah, it is because it's actually one of the Richard Warshak talks about this in his article, that's actually one of the inspirations for how Batman came to be, right? This idea of putting on a mask. And so he's thinking about the mask of Zorro as sort of a persona that a person can put on to essentially become something different. And so it's a foundational part of how he's sort of constructed. So that's definitely an important part of it. But I think there's also, right, the comment, right, sort of mass hero fighting for the little guy. I mean, there is something I think really important to that really sort of Batman's persona is dependent upon the idea that he's looking out for people who can't defend themselves. Because if you can't defend yourself, then you're going to be looking to someone else to give you that kind of protection. And so he steps in as that. And so it does become a sort of an important reference that he's using in terms of creating Batman. Cool,
thank you. Let's see, some other folks were wondering about, this was a really active chat, excuse me, I'm scrolling back. Some other folks are wondering about any relationship between Harvey Dent and Bucky Dent, a World Series MVP on the Yankees. And then other folks said maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure if you're aware of any baseball connections to that character.
I don't actually, no, I don't.
Okay.
That'd be interesting to hear about, yeah.
Very cool. Let's see, okay. So Chris Huffer asks, are there examples of Commissioner Gordon failing? To me, he always seemed like the only consistently noble character in Gotham.
There is. It was actually in Batman Year One. One of his personal failings is that, so in that comic book, Barbara is not his daughter, but it's the name of his wife. So they recently come to Gotham, and you know he's been moved from Chicago to Gotham, and they're trying to figure out how to build a life for themselves. And the stress of the work of Gotham is so intense that one of his personal failings is that he ends up committing an affair against his wife. And she ends up finding out about it. And it's an affair with someone who's like, it's an affair with a detective that he's working with. So then the question becomes, like, when these people take on these jobs to try and protect Gotham, what is it that they're sacrificing as a result of doing that? And in that case, Gordon is sacrificing a personal relationship that he has with his own wife, right? That the job is so stressful that he feels the need to sort of, you know, go out and sort of commit adultery as a way of trying to cope with the stress of the job. And so it shows how it's taking a mental toll on a lot of these different characters.
Sure. Thank you. Matt Ripley asks, my favorite theory is that Batman is the single worst thing to happen to Gotham, as all he does is escalate other mentally ill or traumatized people to up their game. Is a lack of self-awareness necessary in the world's greatest detective?
That's a really interesting question. I think so. I mean, I think the challenging part about it is that Batman realizes, I think, to a certain extent, that he invites more problems. But then the issue becomes, well, who's the only person who can do anything to try and solve that? Well, it's him, right? So he sort of puts himself in these situations. But I certainly agree with this comment related to does he escalate other mentally ill and traumatized people? Absolutely, absolutely. I did not talk about the video games, but in Batman Arkham City, the Joker dies, and it turns out the one person who could have saved him was Batman, and so he feels personally responsible for that. Now, who's the person who loves the Joker more than anything else? Harley Quinn. So here you have an individual who, despite her own failings, is deeply, deeply attached to the Joker, and sort of being with the Joker gives her a sense of meaning in her own life. And by failing to save the Joker, Batman actually contributes to Harley's mental illness. I mean, she gets sort of even worse, as a result. And they're like this sort of extra storylines that are devoted to like trying to explore the post-traumatic stress that she's dealing with as a result of losing the one that, she loved the most. So it's definitely true that in a lot of ways, he actually just makes situations worse, not just for others, but for himself as well.
Sure, thank you. Brad Linville points out, I find it interesting that even the creation of Batman is controversial. The attribution to Bob Kane versus Bill Finger, a dark side and dual from the very beginning.
Yeah, and I think the origins, are interesting. And then the other thing that's really cool to think about is how has Batman changed over time to sort of meet the demands of what people want from him? So some of the films I didn't talk about were like the sort of the ones that are just most universally panned, like the Joel Schumacher films, Batman and Robin, which I think is sort of known as like the worst Batman film ever to be created in existence, and Batman Forever. And that has sort of a very, very different, it's just a live action comic book with all the sort of campiness that you sort of know from the 1960s cartoons, and nobody's serious, and it's just straight action, and it's loud and obnoxious and all this other stuff. And it's like, well, what does that tell us about what people want to see right from it versus a Christopher Nolan trilogy where people are dying and, people are losing loved ones and people are struggling with, these deep issues. The origin of Batman is constantly being, I think, redone depending on who's writing the story.
Thank you. All right. Albert Hart, I see you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that just going back to the "you complete me" phrase, it shouldn't be lost on us that that's a callback to Jerry Maguire, to a scene that a lot of people find, kind of ridiculously romantic and codependent when I forget who says it, whether she says it to him or he says it to her, "you complete me." I think there's sort of a sardonic callback to that. I just don't think we ought to miss that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And it's also cool because what he's doing is he's holding Batman responsible, right? He's saying the only reason why I'm doing this is because you exist.
Yeah, and I can't be a whole person without you. I mean, that's codependence in a nutshell. So I think we shouldn't let that, escape our notice.
That's a very good point. Mm-hmm.
All right. We've got chat and raised hands. Let's go with John Keith. Your hand is up.
Yes, I wanted to go back just for a second to A Death in the Family. So I was a student at Wabash in the late 80s when that was being released. And I think, you're talking about things, Batman being a reflection of the times. I think it's interesting to point out that what they did was a phone number. So, pre-cell phone, pre-internet, seeking the input of readers should Jason Todd die or live? And the vote was for him to die. So in essence, yes, Joker killed him, but really we did.
That's right.
We, and maybe you could say Generation X, I don't know, but we chose for him to die. And I just think that's interesting.
It is. And I remember telling that to my students. And so we did an informal poll in class, and most of them voted for Jason to die as well. And I asked them, well, why is that? And they were just like, because we just don't like him. And I said, okay, well, what is it about, Jake? Because it's like he's so impulsive that I guess they sort of felt like he wasn't fully appreciative of this sort of, mantle that he was being given by Batman, but they just found him to be one of the more problematic iterations of Robin. But it's true, right? I mean, the people spoke and voted for Jason to die. So they were in many ways shaping the future of that story.
Thank you. In the chat, Lawrence Adams asks, any comments on the 1960s TV show and what it says about society at the time? Or how about the foundational Frank Miller series, The Dark Knight Returns and Batman Year One?
Mm-hmm. So this is interesting because they're just polar opposites, right? I mean, the 1960s is essentially meant to be a sort of a happy-go-lucky, cartoons or, kind of like everything is a joke. I mean, the villains are a joke. Batman himself is kind of a joke, like the episode where he's just like, he's carrying around this bomb and he's trying to figure out where to, put it. And then you've got this sort of weird music in the background. It's sort of making complete fun of like the whole thing. And I guess part of the reason for that is because it reflects a society that views superheroes in a very, very different way than this sort of grittier representation of the Frank Miller series. I mean, The Dark Knight Returns is interesting because that's a one where he's not been Batman for a while, and then he comes back because he feels this calling to come back. And it's this idea that like, it's a part of him that he can never let go. And I think that that's something that a lot of people can relate to, sort of aspects of our identity that define us that, we never can sort of really put it behind us. And so it's interesting to think about that sort of, that change in trajectory just in terms of the tone from the 1960s to the more realistic portrayals.
Sure. And I do want to be mindful of time. So Matt Ripley asks in the chat, where do you think Batman falls on the D&D alignment chart? He certainly has a code, but he also seems to be doing so much of things for his own issues.
So wait, D&D align. So wait, what is the D&D for?
Matt, if you want to jump in, I think that's Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh, okay. I was wondering. I was like, is that?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, but
I think that's like the lawful good, lawful neutral, lawful evil.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know it either, but I've seen it in memes.
That's a good question. I mean, I think that his code it's not lawful neutral because there's so much stuff that he does that's unlawful. Is it evil? Not necessarily. I don't think that the intention behind it is. But I guess what I would say is that his code is one that is, I guess, defined really by that sort of one rule of not killing. However, there is a question, which is if he were to just kill the Joker, could we avoid a lot of the things that are going on? If he just pulled the trigger and said, you're done, because he knows he's just going to get locked up and go right back out again, right? So it's his code that almost prevents him from, ending the situation. It's interesting to think about that, yeah.
All right. The rest of the chat looks like it is just chat. Anyone, we have time for maybe one more question. If anyone wants to ask one live, feel free to unmute and hop on. All right, looks like that's it. Chris Huffer says, thanks, Dr. Whitney, very fun in the chat. I agree, very fun indeed. All right, well, if that's that, then we will go ahead and wrap up. Dr. Whitney, thank you so much. Everyone, we've recorded tonight and it will be posted online, hopefully by end of next week. So you can feel free to rewatch, share with your circles, all that good stuff. It'll be on YouTube and I will send out the link. Thank you, Dr. Whitney, so much. I learned a lot and everyone enjoyed. All right, take care, everyone. Good night.